Close your eyes if you'd like, or simply let your gaze go soft, resting on nothing in particular. Let your body settle. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest where they are, open and easy. There is nothing you need to do right now, nothing to hold, nothing to figure out. For the next little while, you are simply here, listening and resting. Tonight we are going somewhere small and quiet and full of the particular wonder that comes from seeing the world from a different angle than usual. Somewhere in the spring countryside of Japan, where the rivers run clear and cold from the mountains, and the cherry blossoms are just beginning to open on the trees along the bank, and the days are long and soft and full of the particular quality of a season that has just arrived and has not yet decided to hurry. There is a small village beside a river. There is an old couple in that village, and between them, a child no larger than a fingertip, who arrived unexpected and small and full of a quality that cannot quite be named, a brightness, a confidence, a sense of being exactly the right size for whatever the world requires. Breathe in slowly and let it out. Part 1. The Village by the River. This is the story of the tiny samurai, and of the river that carried him to the city, and of the life that was waiting for him at the end of the journey. Let it carry you gently into rest. The village sits where a small tributary joins a larger river in a valley that opens toward the south and catches the spring sunlight in a way that makes the village warmer and greener than the villages on either side of it. The river that runs through the valley is not large, not the wide, slow rivers of the lowland plains, but quick and clear and full of the energy of water that has recently come down from mountains, carrying in it the cold of the heights and the particular clarity of water that has not yet had time to pick up the color of the lowlands. In spring the river runs high, fed by the snowmelt from the peaks above, and the sound of it fills the valley from morning to evening, not loud, not overwhelming, but present, a constant and comfortable background to the other sounds of the village, the way a familiar sound becomes simply part of the atmosphere of a place and would be missed immediately if it stopped. The cherry trees along the bank are old. Some of them have been there for generations, their trunks thick and gnarled at the base, their branches spreading wide over the water, and when they bloom in the 3rd month, the whole bank is covered in a pale pink that reflects in the river and makes the water look as if it is carrying blossoms downstream, even when no blossoms have yet fallen. The village is small, perhaps 30 households, and the people in it live in the way that people live in small villages, which is to say, close together and with a particular awareness of each other that larger places do not have, an awareness that can be a comfort and can sometimes be a constraint, but that creates in people who have grown up with it a kind of rootedness, a sense of belonging to a specific place and a specific community that is one of the things that is hardest to replace when it is gone. The work of the village is the work that villages in river valleys do, farming the flat land beside the river, fishing the river itself, cutting wood from the forest on the slopes above, maintaining the paths and the bridges and the waterways that keep the valley usable and livable through all the seasons. The seasons here are distinct and full. spring with its blossoms and its high water and its particular softness, summer with its heat and the deep green of the rice paddies and the sound of the cicadas in the trees, autumn with its harvest and its colors, and the smell of wood smoke beginning to come from the houses in the evenings, winter with its snow and its long, quiet nights, and the river running lower and slower under a skin of ice at the edges. The people here know their valley and their river and their seasons, the way people know things they have grown up with, not always consciously, not always with words, but deeply, in a way that shapes how they move and what they notice and what they feel at home. The village had its particular rhythms that Issun-boshi had grown up inside, without quite seeing them as rhythms, the way a person does not hear the sound of the river they live beside until they go somewhere without a river and notice the absence, and in the years of his childhood, he absorbed these rhythms in the way that children absorb the things that surround them from birth, not as lessons, but as the basic texture of how things are. The morning began with the sound of his father's footsteps on the wooden floor and the sound of the fire being stoked and the particular smell of the breakfast rice beginning to cook that was so consistently the smell of morning that encountering it anywhere always brought him back to this house, this village, this river, valley. The day organized itself around the light, the quality of the spring light that came in through the paper screens in the morning and moved across the floor and the walls through the hours until it left through the western screens in the evening, and the sound of the river that changed through the day as the air changed, closer and louder in the cool of the morning and evening, less present in the heat of the afternoon, when other sounds competed with it. He knew every house in the village by the sound it made, the particular creak of the Tanaka family's gate, the sound of the weaver's loom that began each morning from the house at the northern end, the smell of the blacksmith's fire that drifted through the village when the wind was from the east. These things were not remarkable to him as a child, which is how remarkable things are when they are all you have known. But he came to understand their value later, when he had seen enough of the world to know that a place with this quality of particularity, this density of the known and the familiar, was something worth carrying with you. Part 2. The Old Couple. In this village there lived an old man and an old woman who had been married for so long that the village could not remember a time when they had not been married, which in a small village is a measure of considerable time. They were not remarkable people, in the way that most people are not remarkable. They did their work, they kept their house, they maintained their relationships with their neighbors, with the reliable decency of people who understand that community is something that requires tending, like a garden or a fire, and who tended accordingly. The old man worked the small patch of land behind the house, and fished the river on the days when the fishing was good, and the old woman kept the house and the garden, and made the meals, and managed the household with the practical competence of someone who has been doing this for a long time, and has learned where all the inefficiencies are, and how to work around them. They had no children, which was the one sorrow of their otherwise sufficient life, not a consuming grief, because they had learned to live with it over the years, but a quiet absence that made itself felt Sometimes in the evenings, when the house was particularly quiet, or when they saw the children of their neighbors playing in the lane, or when they thought about who would look after the house when they were gone. They had prayed for a child, as people who want children and have not had them pray, carefully, persistently, without entirely giving up hope, even when hope seemed unreasonable. Part 3. The Arrival. The child came to them on a spring morning, as unexpected and complete as the first cherry blossom of the season, there one day where there had been nothing the day before, small and perfect and entirely itself. He was no larger than a fingertip when he arrived, which was startling in the way that things are startling when they are exactly as the stories describe them, and you did not quite believe the stories until the moment you were standing in them. The old woman found him in the morning, in the room where the morning light came in first, sitting in the patch of sunlight on the floor, with the self-possession of someone who has arrived exactly where they intended to be, and is simply waiting for the household to catch up with the fact of their presence. She called her husband, and he came and looked, and they both stood for a while in the particular silence of people who are trying to decide how to respond to something entirely outside their experience. And then the old woman simply knelt down and held out her hand, and the tiny boy climbed onto her palm with the easy confidence of someone who has no doubt about being welcome, and that was how it began. They called him Issun-boshi, which means one sun boy, a sun being an old unit of measurement roughly equal to the length of a thumb, and the name suited him, direct and practical and accurate, the way the best names are. Part 4. Growing up small. He did not grow in the way that children grow, the steady upward progress that parents mark on door frames and worry about and celebrate, but stayed the size he was, which was very small, and this turned out to be not the limitation it might have seemed, but simply a different way of being in the world, with its own advantages and its own requirements. The old man made him a bed from a lacquer box, lined with scraps of soft cloth, and a table from a spool of thread, and tiny utensils from the points of pins and the caps of acorns. And these things gave the house a second scale of objects that the old woman sometimes stopped to look at, with a pleasure that she could not quite articulate, the way that very small things, made with care, have a quality of completeness about them that full-size things do not always have. Issun-boshi grew up in the house, and in the village, with the cheerful adaptability of someone who has never known any other way of being, and therefore does not experience their circumstances as limiting. He helped with the household work in the ways available to him, keeping watch on things that needed watching, carrying messages between neighbors, doing the small tasks that required someone very small or someone very patient with small spaces. He was not shy about his size, and he did not pretend to be larger than he was, but moved through the world with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who has decided that the world is large and interesting, and that being small in it is simply the particular angle from which he sees it. There were advantages to his size that he discovered gradually, the way a person discovers the advantages of things that are simply given to them at birth, and therefore seem at first like simply the way things are rather than gifts. He could move through spaces that were closed to everyone else, under the floorboards where the cats went in winter, through the gap in the garden wall where the wisteria had worked its way between the stones over many years, into the space beneath the Ingawa, where the light came through in thin lines, and the ground smelled of old wood and earth and the particular dust of places that are rarely disturbed. These places had a quality of privacy and completeness that he valued. The sense of being in the world, and also slightly outside it, close enough to the ordinary life of the house to hear it and smell it and feel its warmth, but in a position of observation rather than participation, which is a useful position for anyone who wants to understand things carefully. He spent a great deal of time observing in the years of his childhood, and what he observed he thought about carefully, and what he thought about carefully he understood with a depth that surprised people sometimes. Not children who performed their understanding for approval, but the kind of understanding that is evident in the quality of the questions a person asks and the things they notice that others do not. The insects that most people stepped over without noticing were, to him, neighbors of a kind. The ants that maintained their roads through the garden with a diligence that he respected. The beetles that moved through the fallen leaves with the unhurried confidence of creatures who know their business. The spiders that built their webs in the corners of the Ingawa with an engineering precision that he found genuinely impressive. He was curious about everything in the way of someone for whom the world is always at a different scale from everyone else, which gives even familiar things an unfamiliarity that keeps them interesting. A blade of grass was, to him, a substantial object with texture and structure, and a particular way of catching the light. A pebble that a person might kick without noticing was, to him, a boulder with its own geography. The river, when he went to its bank with his father on fishing days, was vast and powerful and full of a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the fish in it were creatures of considerable size and dignity, and the whole experience of being beside it was one that reminded him, if reminding were necessary, that the world was very large, and that this was not a problem but a fact, and a rather wonderful one. His parents loved him with the particular intensity of people who have wanted something for a long time and have finally received it, not in the form they expected, but in a form that turned out to be entirely its own and entirely sufficient, and whose particular qualities they had come to appreciate in ways they could not have anticipated before they knew him. The old woman worried about him sometimes, in the way that mothers worry about children who are going to go out into a world that is not scaled for them, and she expressed this worry in the practical way of someone who knows that worry is not useful, but action sometimes is, teaching him everything she knew that might be useful, which turned out to be a great deal. Part 5. The Decision. It was in the spring of his 15th year, though he looked no different from how he had looked at 5, and would look no different at 50, being the kind of person whose age lived in their eyes and their manner rather than in their face, that Issun-boshi told his parents he wanted to go to the capital. He told them this in the direct way he had of saying things that he had thought about carefully and decided, which was different from the way he said things he was uncertain about. There was a settledness to it a quality of something that had been considered from all angles and found to be right, and his parents recognized this quality and understood that it meant what it meant. He told them that he had learned everything the village could teach him, that there was a larger world beyond the valley, and that he wanted to know it, that the capital was where things happened, and where a person could become whatever they were capable of becoming, and that he believed he was capable of more than the village currently had occasion for. He said all of this without arrogance. It was simply a statement of what he understood to be true, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone he brought to everything. And his parents listened and said nothing for a while, because there was nothing to say that would change what they already knew, which was that he was right, and that the time had come, and that the difficulty of letting him go did not make the letting go any less necessary. Part 6. The Preparation. The preparations for the journey were modest, as preparations for a person of Issun-boshi's size necessarily were. A lacquer bowl that would serve as his boat, a chopstick that would serve as his oar and his pole, and, if necessary, his staff, a sewing needle that would serve as his sword, tucked into a sheath of straw, and a small bundle of the things his mother had prepared for him, rice enough for several days, dried fish, a few other things wrapped carefully in leaves and tied with thread. The needle sword was his father's idea, and it was a good one. A needle properly handled is a precision instrument, and the old man had spent an evening showing Issun-boshi the ways it could be used, working through the movements with the seriousness of someone who wants to give what protection he can to someone he loves, who is going somewhere he cannot follow. Issun-boshi received this teaching with the same focused attention he brought to everything, practicing the movements until they felt natural, until the needle was an extension of his hand rather than something he was holding, and thanking his father with the simple sincerity of someone who understands the value of what has been given without making too much of it. The morning of departure came with the particular quality of spring mornings, clear and cool, the cherry trees still in bloom along the river bank, the water running high and fast, with the snow melt, the whole valley fresh and vivid in the early light as if it had been newly made. His parents walked with him to the river, the old man carrying the bowl and the chopstick, the old woman carrying the small bundle, and when they reached the bank, they stood together for a while in the way of people who have things to say and are not sure which of them to say first. Part 7. The River Journey. They said what parents say to children who are leaving. Take care of yourself, eat properly, write when you can, remember where you come from, and Issun-boshi received all of it with the patient affection of someone who knows that these things are not really instructions, but expressions of love in the form that love takes when there is nothing else to give, and he promised what he promised, and then he climbed into the lacquer bowl and took up the chopstick and pushed off from the bank. The river took him immediately, with the decisive ease of water that knows where it is going, and the bowl moved into the current, and the current carried it, and his parents stood on the bank and watched until the river bent, and the trees closed in, and the small shape of the bowl was no longer visible, and then they stood a while longer, looking at the place where it had been, and then they walked home. The journey down the river was the first long journey Issun-boshi had ever made, and it was, for all its simplicity, one of the most beautiful things he had ever experienced. The world from the surface of the water was different from the world seen from the shore, lower, closer to the water itself, with a different relationship to the reflections and the ripples and the way the light moved on the surface. The banks passed on either side, sometimes close and wooded, sometimes opening out into the flat farmland of the valley, and the things he saw from his small bowl were the same things that people walking the riverside path saw, but seen differently, from below, from the water, from the perspective of something that is moving with the current rather than alongside it. He paddled when the current slowed and rested when it was strong, and the river carried him through the days with the patient reliability of something that has been doing this for a very long time and will continue to do it long after this particular journey is over. At night he pulled the bowl to the bank and slept under the overturned bowl the way a person sleeps under a roof, with the sound of the river nearby and the spring peepers calling from the reeds and the stars visible through the gap where the bowl did not quite reach the ground. The spring countryside through which the river ran was at its best in these weeks. The fields newly planted, the hillsides green with the particular vivid green of young growth, the orchards in blossom, the air carrying the mixture of soil and water and flower that is the particular smell of Japan in spring, and that is different from the spring smell of any other place. He ate his mother's carefully prepared food and thought about what lay ahead, and watched the kingfishers that hunted along the river with their particular arrow-quick dives, and listened to the sound the water made over the stones in the shallower sections, and felt, in the way that people feel when they are moving towards something they want, a quality of rightness about the direction he was going that had nothing to do with the certainty of what he would find when he got there. The river grew wider and slower as it descended toward the capital, and the banks became more populated, more cultivated, the signs of a larger and more complex world beginning to appear on either side, more boats on the water, more bridges, more buildings visible through the trees. The nights on the river were their own kind of experience, quieter than the days, with a different quality of sound, the water's conversation with itself more audible in the absence of the daytime sounds, the frogs beginning their evening chorus from the banks, the occasional splash of a fish, the rustling of the reeds in the small breezes that moved along the surface of the water in the cooling evening air. He lay in the bowl on those nights and looked at the sky through the gap above him, the spring sky full of stars that were familiar from the village, but that looked different from the surface of the river, reflected in the water on either side of him, so that he was surrounded by stars above and below, floating between two skies in the way that the river sometimes made you feel when the reflections were very clear. The Milky Way was visible on the clearest nights, a river of light above the river of water, and he thought about the stories he had heard as a child, about the stars, the weaver and the cowherd, the river of heaven that separated them, and felt, floating on his own river under that sky, a kind of kinship with those stories that he had not felt when he heard them in the house by the fire. On the second morning of the journey, he came around a bend in the river and saw a heron standing in the shallows, very tall, very still, its long neck curved in the patient way of herons who are waiting for something and have as much time as is needed for the waiting. The heron looked at him as he passed, with the mild, unsurprised gaze of a creature that has seen many things come down the river and has decided that most of them are not worth more than a glance, and then looked back at the water, and Issun-boshi paddled past with the feeling of having been acknowledged by something old and well established in its ways. Part 8. The Capital. The capital was larger than anything Issun-boshi had imagined, which was saying something because he had imagined it carefully and at length during the journey. The scale of it, the size of the buildings, the number of people, the width of the main streets, the noise and the color and the sheer density of human activity concentrated in one place, was something that could be described but not quite prepared for, the way that certain experiences can be described accurately and still arrive as a surprise when you are inside them. He navigated it the way he navigated everything, carefully, with attention, taking in what he saw without rushing to conclusions about it, finding his way by observation and by the willingness to ask for help when asking was more efficient than wandering. He found his way to the house of a court noble, a large and well-ordered household near the center of the city, and presented himself at the gate with the directness that was his characteristic manner, stating simply that he was looking for a position and that he was prepared to do whatever work was suitable to his particular abilities. The gatekeeper who received him looked at him for a long time without speaking, and then went inside, and came back after a while with the steward of the household, who also looked at him for a long time, and then went inside, and came back after a while with the lord of the house himself, who looked at him for a long time, and then said that he had never seen anything like this before, and that he supposed there was no particular reason why there should not be a position for someone of his size in a household of this kind, and that he would give the matter some thought. The position he was given was that of companion and guard to the Lord's daughter, a young woman named Sanjo Jaime, which was not her formal name but what the household called her, and who had a quality of stillness and observation about her that reminded Issun-boshi, in certain lights, of the river he had traveled down to get here. She received him without the prolonged astonishment that most people required, simply looking at him carefully for a moment, and then asking him, in a practical tone, whether he preferred to travel in her sleeve or to walk beside her, and whether he had any dietary requirements she should know about. He told her that walking suited him well enough in most circumstances, but that the sleeve was useful when the distances were long or the ground was difficult, and that he ate what was available and had no particular requirements, and she nodded and said that she thought this arrangement would work well, and that was the beginning of it. The household was large and well run, with the particular quality of order that comes not from strictness, but from good habits maintained over time, and Issun-boshi settled into it with the adaptability that had characterized him since childhood, finding the ways that he could be useful, learning the rhythms of the place, earning a reputation for reliability and good judgment that had nothing to do with his size and everything to do with the quality of his attention. The seasons passed over the household and over the capital, and Issun-boshi moved through them in the company of Sanjo-hime, who turned out to be a person of considerable depth and considerable patience, and between whom and Issun-boshi there developed, over the months, the kind of easy and honest companionship that develops between people who respect each other and find each other genuinely interesting. Part 9. Life in the Capital. The life of the household followed the rhythm of the capital's seasons, which was different from the rhythm of the village, more ceremonial, more structured, with the observances and festivals and formal occasions that a court household maintained and that gave the year a particular shape of its own. In spring there were cherry blossom viewings, the household moving to the garden or to the park beside the river, to sit under the trees and eat and drink and appreciate the blossoms with the particular attention that Japanese people have always brought to this particular beauty. Not casual appreciation, but something more focused, more aware of the brevity of the thing being appreciated, which gives it a quality that it would not otherwise have. Issun-boshi accompanied Sanjo-hime to these gatherings, and watched them from his particular vantage point, which was lower than anyone else's, and gave him a view of the blossoms from underneath, looking up into the pale pink mass of them against the spring sky, which was not a view that anyone else had, and which he found, every spring, to be one of the more beautiful things available to someone of his size. In summer, the household moved its activities to the cooler parts of the grounds, the garden in the evenings, the rooms where the cross breezes ran, and the long summer evenings were spent in the particular way of court households in summer, with music and with conversation, and with the kind of slow and pleasant passing of time that is possible when the days are long, and the heat is eased, and there is nowhere in particular that needs to be gone to. Autumn in the capital had a quality that was different from autumn in the village, more formal, more observed, with the particular attention that a court household brought to the seasonal transitions, marking them with ceremony and with the arrangement of flowers and the burning of incense, appropriate to the season, and the careful placement of objects that evoked autumn without stating it directly, the way refined taste always prefers suggestion to declaration. The maples in the garden turned in October, with a slowness that rewarded attention. First the tips of the leaves, then the outer branches, then the whole tree, the color moving through the spectrum from green to yellow, to the deep red that Japanese maples achieve in the best years, when the temperature drops at the right time, and the rain comes at the right time, and everything conspires to produce the colors that people come from far away to see. Issun-boshi accompanied Sanjo-hime to the garden, on the evenings when the light was right, for appreciating the maples, and they sat on the ingawa and looked at the trees in the way that people look at things that will not last much longer, with the quality of attention that impermanence calls forth, not sad exactly, but aware, and the awareness making the looking more complete than it would otherwise be. Winter in the capital was colder than it looked. The wind coming off the mountains to the north and moving through the streets and gardens with a sharpness that the architecture of the capital, built for ceremony and for beauty rather than for warmth, did not always deflect. The household moved indoors in the cold months, and the evenings were spent in the heated rooms, with the braziers burning and the paper screens closed against the dark, and there was a quality of enclosure and warmth to these evenings that Issun-boshi associated, ever afterward, with the smell of charcoal and the sound of light rain on the roof, and the particular feeling of being inside a warm room in a cold city in winter. Part 10. The Encounter. It was on an autumn afternoon, when the maples in the garden were at their brightest, and the air had the particular clarity of autumn days in the capital, that the Oni appeared. They came into the garden from the direction of the gate. 2 of them, large and loud in the way of creatures that have never had to consider the feelings of anything smaller than themselves. Not malicious exactly, but careless, the way things are careless when they are very large and have never had occasion to be careful. Sanjo Hime stood very still when she saw them, with the composure of someone who has been raised to maintain composure in exactly these kinds of situations, and Issun-boshi, who was in his usual place at her side, took in the situation with the quick assessment of someone who has spent years thinking about how to navigate a world in which most of the obstacles are larger than he is. He stepped forward, which required a step of considerable resolution given the relative sizes involved, and addressed the Oni in a clear and steady voice, telling them that they were in a private garden and that they should leave, and that if they had any business with the household, they should present themselves at the gate in the usual way and wait to be received. The Oni looked down at him with the surprised expression of creatures who have rarely been addressed by anything this small, and then looked at each other, and then looked back at him, and one of them reached down and picked him up, which was a situation that Issun-boshi had considered as a possibility, and had prepared for accordingly. Part 11. The Needle and the Mallet. What followed was brief and decisive, and, from the Oni's perspective, extremely unpleasant. The needle, wielded by someone who knew exactly what he was doing with it, and who had the advantage of being very small in a situation where very small was strategically useful, did its work with a precision that the Oni had not expected and could not counter, and the encounter ended with the Oni departing in considerable haste and leaving behind in their hurry a small wooden mallet that one of them had been carrying. The mallet was a Uchai no Kazuchi, a lucky mallet, the kind that appears in old stories as an instrument of transformation, capable of making things appear or disappear or change their nature when struck against the ground. Sanjo Hime picked it up and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at Issun-boshi, who was standing in the garden looking entirely composed, for someone who had just faced 2 Oni considerably larger than himself, and she said that she thought she knew what to do with it, and asked if he would like her to try. He said that he would, with the same matter-of-fact tone he brought to everything, and she struck the mallet against the ground once, and then again, and with each strike Issun-boshi grew, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way things grow when they have been ready to grow for a long time and have simply been waiting for the right conditions. When the growing stopped, he was a young man of ordinary height, standing in the autumn garden in the late afternoon light, and the garden looked entirely different from this angle than it had from the angle he had known all his life, and different was not worse, simply different, and he stood for a while taking it in. Part 12. After the change. The world at ordinary height was a different world from the world he had always known, and he moved through the first days of it with the careful attention of someone who is learning a new environment, the same attention he had always brought to things, but applied now to the experience of being the same size as the furniture, the same height as the doors, able to reach things that had always been far above him, and to see over things that had always obscured his view. He found, as the days passed, that he missed some things about his former size, the particular quality of seeing the world from close to the ground, the relationship with small things that had always been objects of interest, rather than things walked past without noticing, the vantage point under the cherry blossoms that he had valued each spring, and would now have to find a different way of approximating. But he found other things that were new and good, the ease of moving through the world without the constant navigation that small size had required, the ability to be useful in ways that had been closed to him before, the experience of shaking hands with people at a height where they could look him in the eye without kneeling. Sanjohime watched him navigate the change with the fond attention she had always brought to watching him navigate things, and they continued to talk in the easy way they had always talked, and the companionship between them, which had been built on something more substantial than the circumstances of his size, remained what it had been and became, with time and with the natural logic of two people who have spent years in each other's good company, something more. Part 13. The Return. He went back to the village in the spring, as he had always intended to do when he had something worth going back with, and his parents stood at the door of the house and looked at the young man walking up the path, and did not recognize him until he was close enough that they could see his eyes, which were the same eyes they had always known. And then his mother wept, and his father said nothing for a long time, and then said something about the cherry trees being particularly good this year, which was the way he expressed things that were too large for direct expression. He stayed for some weeks, helping with the spring planting and the fishing and the maintenance of the house, doing the work with the competence of someone who has been away long enough to have missed it, and his parents watched him with the particular pleasure of people who have something back that they thought they might not get back, and the house was full in a way that it had not been for a long time. He told them about the river journey, and the capital, and the household, and Sanjohime, and they listened with the focused attention of people who are storing up what they are hearing to take out and think about later. And when he had finished, his mother said that she was glad he had found people who were worthy of him, which was not exactly what she meant, but was close enough. And his father said that it was good that the needle had been useful. He returned to the capital when the spring was fully established, carrying with him the memory of the village and the river and his parents' faces at the door, which was a good memory to carry, and one he returned to often in the years that followed. And so the story of the tiny samurai settles into the warmth of the spring evening, like the cherry blossoms settling onto the surface of the river, like the sound of the current moving over the stones in the quiet after the day's work is done. He was real, in whatever way such things are real. Real as the needle in the straw sheath was real. Real as the river that carried the lacquer bowl downstream in the spring light. Real as the care of the old couple who made a bed from a lacquer box and a table from a spool of thread, and loved what they had been given with the whole of what they had to give. Stories like this one carry something true in them about size, and about the way that the size of a thing and the quality of a thing are not the same thing, that what a person is capable of has very little to do with how large they are, and a great deal to do with the quality of their attention, and the steadiness of their character, and the willingness to step forward when stepping forward is required. They carry something true about rivers, about the way that moving water takes you where you need to go, if you are willing to get into the boat and trust the current, and about the particular quality of spring rivers, high with the snowmelt, running clear and cold and full of the energy of the season. They carry something true about the world, seen from close to the ground, about the things that are visible from there, that are not visible from higher up, the texture of the grass, and the architecture of the small stones, and the way the light falls differently at that level, and about the value of having once known the world at that scale, whatever scale you inhabit afterward. Let these things rest in you now. You have traveled tonight through the spring countryside of old Japan, down a river in a lacquer bowl with a chopstick for an oar, through the blossoming orchards and the new green fields and the wide slow water of the river approaching the capital, and into the life of a household and a city, and a companionship that turned out to be worth the journey. The river is still there, running in its spring fullness, carrying whatever is entrusted to it downstream, with the patient, unhurried confidence of water that knows where it is going. The cherry trees are still there along the bank, their blossoms opening in the third month as they have always opened, pale pink against the spring sky, reflected in the water below. The old couple is still there in their house by the river, in the story, tending their garden and their fire and their love for a child, who came to them small and left them full-sized, and came back to them in the spring with the river still in his eyes. Let it all soften now, the lacquer bowl on the river, the needle in its straw sheath, the autumn garden and the lucky mallet, the cherry blossoms falling into the current, the sound of the water over the stones in the clear spring evening. Let it dissolve gently, like the cherry blossoms that last only a week and are beautiful partly because of it, like the sound of a river that continues after you've stopped listening. There is nothing left to hold tonight, nothing to figure out, nothing to carry. You are warm, and you are still, and you are exactly where you should be. The river is patient. The spring night is kind. Let your breathing slow. Let the quiet take you. Rest well. Sleep well. Good night.